Welcome back, everybody. This is English 247. This is for our class for Thursday, and that happens to be the 3rd of June. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about life in the 1800s for female in Britain. You remember that last class we reviewed the Culture True Womanhood, a survey of women's magazines at the time to try to give us a sense of what life might have been like. And I wanted to segue into Frankenstein. So, in terms of female in the 1800s, I wanted to read you a passage from the American Girl's Handybook in 1887. And this led to the scouting movement. There was also a companion piece, the American Boy's Handybook. But I thought the American Girls Handybook, which helped to form girls' clubs and organizations, including Campfire Girls, could give us a sense, again, of what life was like in the 1800s for female. And I'm reading from the foreword, in which it states, "If girls in Victorian America were confused, who could blame them? From every quarter, they heard conflicting voices, each confidently articulating its own version of what girls needed. One voice belonged to Dr. Edward Clark, retired member of the Harvard University Medical Faculty and author of the 1873 book, Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. Fair chances notwithstanding, Dr. Clark enlisted his medical training to denounce the burgeoning phenomenon of advanced education for adolescent girls. Whether at teacher training institutions, women's colleges, or co-educational state universities, Clark warned, girls were in grave danger of physical and mental ruin. The reason? The female body, with its limited available energy, could not successfully meet the physical demands of puberty while also enduring the mental strain of study. Something would have to give, and what essentially gave were the reproductive organs. Citing case studies of Vassar women, Clark sought to provide scientific evidence that too much study, and certainly any attempt to match male educational achievements, would sap the developing female organs, leaving girls weak, nervous, and sterile. A frightening prospect for what girl wanted to end up like 18-year-old Miss D, who emerged from 4 years at Vassar an hysterical invalid, her breasts and reproductive organs withered from excessive study and physical exercise. So while you have individuals like Dr. Clark presenting large quantities of rest for growing girls, there were others, including Linda and Adelia Beard, who are responsible for writing this particular text, the Handy Girl's Guide to Life. They suggested that basically the exact opposite should occur. And in fact, we talked a little bit about dress reformers who were routinely trying to denounce the restrictive clothing worn by Victorian women and the daughters of Victorian women as well. So, the American Girl's Handybook talks a little bit about the need for a girl to have exposure to nature, to be healthy and vigorous, and most of all, to be handy. And basically, the Beard sisters argued that the girls of the medical journals or the saintly figures of popular literature were nothing like real life girls. That a real life girl was a flesh and blood individual whose interests and activities basically told us about who she was as an individual. There were also ideas of what was expected for boys during this time period, that boys would have wild natures that would need to be tamed in one way or another. And in the American Boy's Handybook, it talks a little bit about a boy's will was something that needed to be broken, the way one breaks a horse. Spare the rod and spoil the child referred almost entirely to boy children. And then in America, at least, and in New England after 1820 or so, an unbroken boy was usually seen as something that was good rather than bad, and they were encouraged to be able to exercise their free will. This is a quote. "Free in a way that no woman ever is in her entire life, or even desires to be. Free in a way that very few grown-up men were able to remain. And they use the example of Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn as an example of that, if you've ever read that particular piece. We talked a little bit too about how ultimately reading could be very dangerous because it could either cement stereotypes or it could question stereotypes. And even if it wasn't fiction, think about something like Darwin's Origin of Species, which came out in 1859, which basically was trying to use science to indicate the inferiority of women, again, because of their ability to reproduce. And craniologists at the time would basically argue that men had superior intellectual ability because their brains were larger. But probably my favorite of all of this, and there's a picture of this here that you can look at, is a booklet that was distributed by doctors at the time, is College Bad for Girls. So this was a booklet that was a 1906 medical pamphlet. And the title is College Bad for Girls, talks a little bit about the attitudes and sentiments during the time period. And the articles, if you can see the text below, if we were meeting in person, I would actually bring you the actual piece. It's something that I found in an antique shop actually a few years ago in New Jersey. It's hanging in my office, but I did take a picture of it so that you could see it, even though you can't necessarily interact with it. And some of the articles below, if you can see through the picture, the evils of dormitory life, midnight hours of who knows what, or forming unladylike habits that may harm the health and morals of a delicate girl, such as smoking and card playing. And perhaps for our purposes, most important, reading improper novels, magazines, and other suggestive literature. And might I suggest that that's exactly what we are going to be doing, is reading some of that suggestive literature that sparked concerns during that time period. That's not to say that things ended when we moved into the 1900s, and I just wanted to very quickly read you a teacher's contract that came out in 1923 and the Board of Education. And basically, this was an 8-month contract in 1923, and the teacher agreed to the following: not to get married. The contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher marries. Think about this when we read something like Jane Eyre. Number 2, not to keep company with men. Number 3, to be home between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. unless in attendance at a school function. Number 4, not to loiter downtown in ice cream parlors. I suppose those were considered the seedy areas. Number 5, not to leave town at any time without the permission of the chairman or the board of trustees of the school. Number 6, not to smoke cigarettes. This contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher is found smoking. Number 7, not to drink wine, beer, or whiskey. This contract becomes null and void immediately if the teacher is found drinking any of those. Number 8, not to ride in a carriage or an automobile with any man except her brothers or father. Number 9, not to dress in bright colors. Number 10, not to dye her hair. Number 11, to wear at least 2 petticoats. Number 12, not to wear dresses more than 2 inches above the ankle. Number 13, to keep the schoolroom clean. And then also number 14, not to use face powder, mascara, or paint the lips. This is from the Brunswick Teachers Association, and this was a contract in 1923 for Miss Jones, a teacher, and the Board of Higher Education of Middleton School. Needless to say, I would not be able to abide by the rules of that contract, and I would probably be terminated. Well, I would never be hired to begin with. And then I wanted to review for you something that you might have seen online before called the Good Wives Guide. Supposedly this appeared in a women's magazine in the 1950s. There's been some dispute about this, but even if it didn't necessarily appear exactly in this form, the sentiments would have been the sentiments of the 1950s. And this Good Wives Guide gives tips on how a woman should behave in the home. Again, in the 1950s. Number 1, have dinner ready. Plan ahead, even the night before, to have a delicious meal ready on time for his return. This is a way of letting him know that you have to be thinking about him and are concerned about his needs. Most men are hungry when they get home, and the prospect of a good meal is part of the warm welcome needed. Number 2, prepare yourself. Take 15 minutes to rest so you'll be refreshed when he arrives. Touch up your makeup, put a ribbon in your hair, and be fresh looking. He has just been with a lot of work-weary people. Number 3, be a little gay and a little more interesting for him. His boring day may need a lift. One of your duties is to provide it. Number 4, clear away the clutter. Make one last trip through the main part of the house just before your husband arrives. Run a dust cloth over the tables. The next one is, during the cooler months of the year, you should prepare and light a fire for him to unwind by. Your husband will feel he has reached a haven of rest and order, and it will give him a lift too. After all, caring to his comfort will provide you with immense personal satisfaction. The next is, minimize all noise. At the time of his arrival, eliminate all noise of the washer, dryer, or vacuum. Encourage the children to be quiet. The next is, be happy to see him. The next is, greet him with a warm smile and show sincerity in your desires to please him. The next is, listen to him. You may have a dozen important things to tell him, but the moment of his arrival is not the time. Talk to him first. Remember, his topics of conversation are more important than yours. The next, don't greet him with complaints or problems. The next, don't complain if he's late for dinner, even if he stays out all night. Count this as minor compared to what he might have gone through at work. The next is, make him comfortable. Have him lean back in a comfortable chair or lie him down in the bedroom. Have a cool or warm drink ready for him. The next is, arrange his pillow and offer to take off his shoes. Speak in a low, soothing, and pleasant voice. The next is, don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such, will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. And then lastly, a good wife always knows her place. And the 1950s was really not that long ago when you think about it. So I think all of this can help give us a sense of what the society would have expected of female, and how the authors we're reading were really so revolutionary and really helped to defy many of the expectations of the time period. I wanted to briefly talk about the journal assignment, and our first journal is going to be on Frankenstein. So all of this was basically introduction, including talking about the story of an hour, which I discussed last class, but certainly you can reference any of those throughout the course of the semester. But your first journal is going to be due on the 8th of June, and that's on Tuesday, midnight, via PDF, and that is to my email at Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. And I believe I have the date right for that, if I'm correct, that is the 8th of June. I will double check that. It is in our syllabus. But basically, what I wanted us to do was to talk a little bit about Frankenstein, and also to watch the very iconic film Frankenstein of the 1930s, which you probably know from popular culture, although it is very different from the text that Mary Shelley wrote. I'll double check on that date, but I'm pretty sure I've got the correct date here. And basically, in terms of thinking about I think actually I have the wrong date. I don't think it is on the 8th on Tuesday, but if you look down in the notes below, I will have the correct date listed for you. And you should send that via PDF to my email, which is ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And basically what I'm asking is for a page or so of reflections and questions, and thoughts and responses to Frankenstein. And again, you can reference anything that I've discussed about life in the 1800s, or even the story of an hour, and even the movie I'm going to be asking you to watch during this class as well. But I'll talk a little bit more about the journals after we've had a few classes to be able to discuss the journals, and also to discuss the text itself, Frankenstein. And I've put in the syllabus and other documents folder a list of suggested paper topics, because eventually you will be running a paper on one of the texts that we are discussing. I will discuss the paper topics later in another class, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley in 1818, to try to give you a sense of the novel. And I had indicated that ideally what would happen is that you would have the novel read in its entirety, even though we've got had several classes devoted to it, but you would have it read in its entirety in the beginning so that you could proceed to the next piece, which happens for us to be Persuasion. And if you are proceeding with Persuasion, I can tell you that it is a very long and leisurely read, and it's done very deliberately to try to give us a sense of what life might have been like for the very privileged female during the time period. That's a very deliberate stylistic choice. You're not particularly supposed to like these characters who are very self-centered and very self-privileged. So keep that in mind when you are reading the text. But going back to Frankenstein, and I put the text in chronological order because I wanted us to see progression through time periods. So Mary Shelley's is the first in 1818, married to the famous Percy Shelley, the poet, the romantic poet during the time period. But Mary Shelley had another claim to fame. She was also the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a very famous feminist, which I think had something to do with Mary Shelley's attitudes towards life. And this book, Frankenstein, was actually written as part of a horror competition. And in fact, the text is oftentimes read in Gothic literature. I assign this text in Gothic literature because it's one of probably the most famous Gothic texts, along with Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's oftentimes studied in science fiction classes as well. But basically, Mary Shelley was vacationing with Percy Shelley and with friends, and it was very rainy outside, so they couldn't really go outdoors and enjoy themselves. So basically, what they did was they dared themselves to write a ghost story and have a competition. And of course, as I indicated, this story straddles lots of different literary genres: Gothic, science fiction, but most important, feminist. And that said, one of the ways that Frankenstein is unusual from the other texts we will be reading is that we don't really have central female characters. I believe that's a very deliberate choice from Mary Shelley, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why when we actually get into the text itself. Now, Mary Shelley's husband edited this text, and he also suggested that she expand it. And I've had many contemporary readers read the text Frankenstein and argue that there are these long unnecessary passages of descriptions of nature, which was common during the time period, but especially for someone like Percy Shelley, who is a romantic poet. And the romantic poets were known for their celebration of the natural world. So obviously his hand is in this novel. And there have even been some questions about whether or not we could completely attribute this novel to Mary Shelley if her husband did some editorial work and he gave some suggestions. And I do wonder that if Mary Shelley had been a male author and it was the female spouse that had given the suggestions, if this question would even arise. But it's not at all unusual for an author to get editorial feedback. So I don't see that in any way negating Mary Shelley's vision or in any way negating Mary Shelley's authorship. And a point I forgot to mention about the Good Wives guy that probably occurred to you as I was reading that. Notice that the only relationship that's presented is a heterosexual relationship in terms of marriage. And that's something also to keep in mind in relation to the time period that we are discussing and some of the stereotypes and prejudices during that time period. So, the 1930s Universal Studio film that's become part of popular culture with Boris Karloff is probably what most people are familiar with when it comes to Frankenstein. The film, which changed dramatically for Hollywood. In part, it was shortened. The novel Frankenstein is much longer, so they simplified it and they eliminated some characters and they even changed around some character names. And next class, I'll talk about why they did that. And I've had contemporary audiences say that watching the film sometimes confuses them when they're also reading the novel because the names Victor and Frankenstein, or Victor and Henry, are basically switched in the film. So think of the film as a completely separate story that's just very loosely based on Mary Shelley's work. And also what we will see in Mary Shelley's work is that it is what we call an epistolary novel that I will talk about over the next class or so. It means it was written in letters, and that's difficult to basically translate over into film. So I think that was another reason for some of the simplifications that occurred. the plot is going to be different, the structure is going to be different, the character names are going to be different, the length is going to be different. And it's basically cemented in popular culture's mind that Frankenstein is the name of the monster, or as I call him, the creature. Because I think one of the central questions in Mary Shelley's text is, what is monstrous? And the creature is not so much monstrous as humanity is monstrous. And we see this through the creator, and the way the creator, Victor Frankenstein, in the novel is so self-centered that first he creates life from death, which is an unnatural act, and secondly, he negates his responsibility for that. Again, Hollywood sort of changed it around so that the creature would be seen as a kind of monstrosity just because of its appearance and perhaps its behavior. But even in the movie, one of the great things that the actor does, Boris Karloff, is give a very sympathetic view to the creature. We'll talk about this some more after you've seen the film. I realize some of you have never watched this film by James Whale, and it is a classic film. So I'd like you to spend the rest of the class, so to speak, watching that film, and you can see in the notes below I've included a link. And then next class we can begin to discuss the novel, and then this is due on our class discussion forum on Friday the 4th, which means that if I'm just doing my math right, your journal couldn't be due on the 8th. It must be due after that. So I will definitely change the date on our notes below. But for today's attendance question, which I'd like you to try to answer by Friday the 4th, 9 a.m. And again, if you have any need for an extension, just ask me for one, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. But basically, I'm trying to duplicate what we would do in a live class. And in a live class, we would meet on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 9 a.m. So this is one of the questions I would have asked during a live class is, did you like or dislike the 1931 film version of Frankenstein, and why? Because if we were meeting live, I would actually show you that film, which is approximately an hour and 15 minutes long. However, luckily, it is in the National Archives, so you can go to the link there and watch it on your own. Even if you have seen the film before, I encourage you to watch it again, because you probably are going to be watching it from a different perspective now that you are engaged in reading the novel and also engaged in thinking about life in the 1800s and even the early to mid 1900s for female during the time period. So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, we will talk about Frankenstein. And then when we're done talking about Frankenstein, you'll have your first journal due. Though you can always hand in early journals. But I'll talk more about journals and papers next class. Take care. Bye-bye.